Hey there, listeners. Welcome back to Mr. Lights are on. Tonight's episode is something a little different. Instead of my usual tale of creepy happenings and ghostly encounters, I'm sharing something that happened to me. Something so unnerving that it's hard to even put it into words. But it's real, and it came to me in an email from a listener, one of you. This happened only a few weeks ago, and I still can't quite shake the feeling. I know you'll understand once I tell you what happened. This is a story about the darkest night of my life. A night that has me questioning everything. I was at my cabin, alone, just like I've always been. I've gotten used to the isolation, the creaks of the old wood, and the strange sounds that come when the wind hits just right. But that night there was something off. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't the usual flicker of the lights or the whisper of the trees outside. No, this felt different. It felt personal. The email that triggered it all had been too brief. I need your help. Something is happening to me, and I don't know who to talk to. Please, listen to me. It was from a listener I'd never heard from before. The name was unfamiliar, but something about the words struck a chord deep within me. I remember sitting in my armchair, reading the email, my fingers lingering over the keyboard as I tried to decide whether to reply or not. The message had a sense of urgency, like a whisper from the dark that you just couldn't ignore. But the more I read, the more the words started to blur. It wasn't the message itself, it was the way my eyes kept drifting to the windows. There was something out there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Like eyes watching me from the trees. For some reason, I felt compelled to reply. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me, or maybe it was the fact that I had just been staring at the same cabin walls for days. But I typed a quick response, asking for more details. I didn't think it would escalate into anything, but it did. The reply came within minutes, and it was chilling. Don't go to sleep tonight. He knows you're there. At first, I thought it was some prank or a mistake, but then I saw the timestamp. It was sent at exactly 2:33 a.m., and something about that time sent a shiver down my spine. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a strange coincidence, maybe a glitch in the system. But I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping over me, that strange sense of being watched. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked outside. Nothing, just the same dark woods, silent and still. But there was something else now, a shadow, something moving. I couldn't quite place it, but it was there right outside my cabin. It wasn't an animal, not a person. It was just wrong. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. I jumped, startled by the sudden sound breaking the silence. The new email popped up. This one was much longer. Please, you have to listen. It's him. He's been following me for days. I don't know where he came from or why he's doing this, but he's getting closer. Every night, he's there, watching me. And now, I can hear him. He whispers my name. He's coming for you too. I stared at the screen, frozen, heart pounding in my chest. The name on the email this time was familiar, the same as the person who had sent the first email. But it was more than that. Something about the phrasing, the tone felt like it was coming from inside the cabin. It was too much of a coincidence. I checked my surroundings again. No sign of movement outside, no sound. But I still couldn't shake that oppressive feeling. I knew I had to do something. The darkness of the woods pressed in on me, suffocating. The silence was louder than any scream. What happened next was something I'm still trying to understand. The unease I felt gnawed at me, but I tried to stay calm. I locked the door and turned off all the lights, sitting in complete darkness, save for the dull glow of the phone screen. I kept staring at that last message, trying to make sense of it. But the words were becoming harder to read, as though they were shifting or moving on the page. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the cabin's door. It made me jump, nearly dropping my phone. My heart raced. I couldn't breathe for a moment, too afraid to move. I stared at the door, listening, but all I could hear was the silence that followed the sound-empty, oppressive silence. Another thud. Louder this time. I didn't know what to do. I thought about grabbing my keys, rushing out of the cabin, but I was paralyzed by the fear that whatever was out there might already be inside, just waiting for me to make a sound, to make a move. A whisper, a voice, coming from the direction of the door, so quiet, so faint that I could barely hear it. Come out, come out, come out. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was just playing tricks on me, but the voice wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It was a rasping, breathless sound, like someone was suffocating just beneath the surface of the words. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. This couldn't be happening. I had to stay focused. I had to think. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the door, my breath shallow. As I moved closer, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "You're not safe. He's already here." I froze. My heart stopped for a moment. I didn't need to hear any more. I knew whatever this was, it was real. It was here. The door handle began to jiggle. I rushed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood by the trees, just beyond the reach of the cabin's weak porch light. It was tall, too tall and thin, impossibly thin, like a shadow that had somehow taken shape. Its limbs were twisted in unnatural angles, as if they didn't belong to a human body at all. Its face was hidden in darkness, but I could see its eyes, glowing faintly, like two pinpricks of light in the pitch-black night. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stared, horrified. The figure tilted its head as though it could sense my gaze. Then it began to move, gliding toward the cabin with disturbing speed, its limbs jerking unnaturally. It didn't make a sound, not a single footstep. Just the rustling of the wind and the soft scraping of its long, claw-like fingers against the wooden walls of the cabin. I had no choice. I had to do something. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, but as soon as I turned it on, it flickered and died. The whole cabin plunged into darkness. The fear that coursed through me was suffocating. My chest tightened, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I heard it, the soft scrape of something against the window. I rushed over, my heart threatening to explode. I could see nothing through the glass, but I could feel it. Something was right there, close enough to reach through the glass to grab me. I backed away, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, like a desperate scratching, frantic and urgent. It was coming from inside the walls now. I couldn't think. I couldn't make sense of it. The fear was all-consuming. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I stumbled back to the door, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I couldn't face whatever was out there. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. I glanced down, seeing that there was another email waiting. This one too was from the same listener, but the subject line was different. "He's inside." I hesitated before opening it. I don't know why I did. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe I thought there was still a chance to make sense of everything. I clicked on it. I thought I was safe, but he's here. He's inside my house. I can hear him. He's whispering to me. He's whispering to you too, isn't he? You can't escape him. No one can. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That was the last message I saw before everything went dark. The phone slipped from my hand and crashed to the floor as the lights flickered and went out. But the whispers? They didn't stop. They only grew louder, surrounding me, drowning out all other sounds. There was no escape. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then I heard it clearer than ever. A voice. It wasn't whispering anymore. "I've been waiting for you. The last thing I remember was the cold, shadowy figure coming through the door, its pale, featureless face looming over me, its breath chilling the very air around me. I woke up to the sound of rain against the windows, but there was something unsettling about the way it pounded. Not the usual rhythmic patter you'd expect on a stormy night, but more like a force, a deliberate hammering, like something was trying to break through. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. The room was still dark, the air thick with tension. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here or what had happened last. My head ached, and I felt disoriented, as though I had been asleep for days or had just been in something else. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't where I'd dropped it. My hand brushed across the cold wooden floor as I tried to orient myself in the unfamiliar stillness. A chill crawled up my spine, and then I heard it again, the whispers. But this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from inside my head. "Wake up! Wake up! Come out!" I gasped and stood up, my knees buckling as I tried to steady myself. The cabin looked normal. The lights were back on, flickering weakly as they always had. The door was still locked. The windows were secure. But something was wrong, very wrong. The darkness outside wasn't just the absence of light. It was waiting for something I couldn't quite understand. I walked to the window again, looking out through the rain-soaked glass. Nothing. And then I saw it. A face in the window. Not the shadowy figure I had seen earlier. This face was different. It was too close, too sharp, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its skin was paper thin, stretched tight over bone, and its mouth was cracked open in a silent scream that never reached my ears. The figure wasn't just outside. It was on the other side of the glass, breathing against it. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I looked away, then back again, but the face was gone. Only the rain left behind faint streaks on the glass. But I could still feel its presence, like a weight on my chest. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. I needed to get out. I needed to leave this place, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by fear. Then the phone buzzed again. I reached down to grab it, fingers trembling as I saw the subject line. "I'm sorry, but it's too late." I opened the message, not knowing what I was about to see. It was a photo, a picture of my cabin from the outside. The photo was taken from the woods, not from the road, but from somewhere much closer, somewhere hidden in the trees. And the figure was in the picture too. This time, it was standing at the door. It was clear now the face was unmistakable. It wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. It was there. "He's inside," the email read. "And now he's with you. He's been waiting for you all along. You can't escape. You can't leave." I could feel the blood drain from my face as I reread the words. The panic started to rise again, choking me. My throat was tight, and the room seemed to close in on me. The walls felt thinner now, more fragile. Like the cabin itself was just a thin barrier separating me from something much worse. Suddenly, I heard a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across the floor. From behind me, I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the dim, flickering light. But I could feel it. Whatever was here was close. Too close. The whispers had stopped, but there was no mistaking it anymore. It wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't just some supernatural thing that could be explained away with some old tale. This was real. This was something that had been following me. The phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't even need to open it. I knew it would be from the same person, the same email address, and I knew what it would say. "Look behind you." Before I could turn around, a cold, clammy hand gripped my shoulder from behind. It was ice cold, like it had been submerged in the deepest part of the ocean for centuries. I tried to scream, but the sound didn't leave my throat. I could barely breathe, my body frozen in place as a whisper, too close now, filled my ears. "You shouldn't have come here." I slowly turned my head, but I couldn't see anything. There was nothing there. But I felt it. The presence. The thing that had been with me since I first read that email, that had somehow crossed the boundary between worlds to follow me here. I could hear its breathing now, a slow, shallow exhale, like it was savoring my fear. I wanted to move. I wanted to run, but my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the terror clawing its way up my spine. And then, I saw it again. Not outside the window this time, not through the walls, but standing in the room with me, its face inches from mine. It was smiling. That's when I knew. It wasn't after me. It was in me. The same whispers, the same cold-handed was a part of me now. The email I had received was just the beginning. It was the first sign that I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. There was no going back. I had let something in, something that wouldn't let me go. I had become a part of its story now. And it wasn't done with me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the thing that was standing just inches from me. Its eyes were glowing faintly in the dim light, but it wasn't its eyes that terrified me. It was the smile. A wide, grotesque grin, stretching across its face like it was enjoying my fear, savoring every second of my panic. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight back, but my body wouldn't obey. The terror had paralyzed me, held me in place like a prisoner, and all I could do was stare. My thoughts were a blur, like my mind was scrambling to make sense of what was happening. But then, through the chaos of my racing heart and the deafening silence of the cabin, a single thought broke through. It knew me. It knew everything about me. The stories I'd told on my podcast, the way I had connected with you, the listeners, over all these months it had been watching me all along, and now it had finally found me. I didn't dare look away from the thing in front of me. I felt its gaze locking onto me, as if it was seeing deep inside me, reading my soul. And then, in a voice that wasn't its own, it spoke. "You're mine now." The words didn't make sense. They were like echoes, bouncing around in my head, warping in and out of focus. But they felt real, more real than anything I had ever experienced. The air in the cabin grew heavy, suffocating. I could barely breathe. The creature, or whatever it was, began to move closer, its face still inches from mine, its eyes gleaming like burning coals. I could smell it now, a rancid, rotten scent like decay and wet earth. My stomach turned, and I fought to swallow down the bile that rose in my throat. Suddenly, the creature's hand shot out, gripping my throat with an inhuman strength, lifting me off the ground. The pressure was unbearable. My vision blurred as I struggled to breathe, my feet kicking helplessly. My pulse thundered in my ears, and for a moment, everything went dark. But just as quickly, the grip loosened. I gasped, choking in a breath of air, falling to the floor in a heap. When I looked up again, the thing was gone. Not just out of the room, but completely vanished. There was no trace of it, as though it had never been there at all. The cabin was still, silent once more. But the air was thick with a sense of something unfinished, like a promise that hadn't yet been fulfilled. I lay there for a moment, too shaken to move, my mind racing with questions, with dread. What had just happened? Was it over? The phone buzzed again. A single message. I grabbed it, my fingers trembling. "I told you it was too late. He's inside you now." My blood ran cold. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. My whole body was trembling, my mind screaming for a way out. But I couldn't escape it. It wasn't just the creature. It was everything: the email, the warning, the feeling that had been growing inside me ever since I read that first message. I had invited it in. The room suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the whispers started again. But this time, they were louder. They were coming from inside me, scratching at the edges of my thoughts, demanding my attention. Wake up, come out. I closed my eyes, trying to block them out, but they were inside me, everywhere. It was too much. And then I realized something. The creature hadn't just been watching me, it had been waiting for me. All along, just like the listener who had sent that first email, it had known that I would be the one to reach out, the one to listen, the one to fall into this trap. Suddenly, the floor beneath me began to shift. The walls warped, the room distorted like I was sinking into something deep and endless. I tried to stand, but my legs gave way beneath me, sending me crashing to the floor. The ground felt soft, like I was sinking into it. I reached out, grabbing for anything to steady myself. But everything around me was changing. The edges of the room bled into darkness, and the only thing I could hear was the incessant whispering louder now, like 1,000 voices filling my head. And then, in the chaos, I saw it again. The figure, standing just beyond the fading light. This time, it was different. The face wasn't hidden. I could see it clearly now. It was my own. The creature, whatever it was, had morphed, taken the shape of me, as if it had consumed me, become me. Its smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, and the eyes, they were mine too, but cold, empty, like mirrors reflecting only darkness. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my voice wouldn't come. I felt the world slip away from me as I stared at the thing that had replaced me. And then, the final whisper rang out in my ears. You're part of the story now. The cabin was gone. There was nothing but darkness. But in the silence, I heard something that I hadn't noticed before. A faint buzzing, like a notification on a phone. I opened my eyes, or I thought I did, but there was nothing around me. Only that buzzing sound, getting louder, until it filled the space completely. And then, the screen lit up. A new email appeared. The email notification blinked at me, the faint light of the screen piercing the darkness. I had no idea where I was anymore. No walls, no floor beneath me, just the weight of something, waiting. But the email, it called to me. I didn't want to open it. I shouldn't have, but I had to. Something inside me told me it was the only way to understand, to know what had happened, to find out how this nightmare could endure, if it ever would. With trembling hands, I reached out, my fingers brushing across the cold, glowing screen. The words were already there, but I couldn't read them at first. The text warped and shifted, like it was alive, bending in unnatural ways. But then it snapped into focus. You are here now. You are part of the story. Welcome. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. The words felt like a mockery, like it knew how lost I was, how far gone I had become. But I was already too deep. There was no escape. The thing that had haunted me, the whispers, the figure, it was me now. I had become part of the nightmare, part of its endless story. Suddenly, the space around me shifted again. I felt a jolt, like being yanked through a dark tunnel, everything around me swirling and twisting into shapes that didn't belong. It felt like I was being pulled somewhere dark and cold and unending. The air around me was thick with whispers, the sounds swirling in a language I couldn't understand but felt deep inside me. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of a vast, empty space. At first, I thought it was the same thing that had followed me, but no. This one was different. It was larger, its shape indistinct, like a dark mass shifting and growing. Tendrils of shadow reaching out in every direction. It spoke. I've been waiting for you. This is your final step. The voice wasn't a whisper, but it wasn't loud either. It sounded like 1,000 voices overlapping, echoing in my head, the words twisting around me. You've already crossed the line. You brought it in. And now, you belong here. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The weight of its presence pressed down on me, suffocating. This place, wherever it was, felt like it existed outside of time. There was no up, no down, no sense of where I was or where I had come from. It was as though the very concept of the world was breaking apart. And then I heard it again. That voice. You were always supposed to find the story, but it was never meant to end. I was the story now. My thoughts, my fear, my pain, they had become part of it, just as the creature had become part of me. There was no escape, no place left to run. I had become an endless thread in its web, caught in a loop that I could never break. The figure loomed closer, its tendrils reaching out like dark hands, brushing against the edges of my consciousness. I felt myself being pulled toward it, pulled into the depths of whatever this place was. Your story is just beginning, the voice rumbled, like thunder shaking the very fabric of existence. You're the one who will bring others in now. They'll hear your voice, they'll feel your fear, and they'll follow. I could feel it now, the urge to tell the story, to share what had happened to me. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, urging me to speak, to share everything. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Instead, I felt something rising inside me. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a dark urge, something that wanted to reach out to you, the listeners, the ones who were still waiting for the next story. And I knew that once I spoke, once I told the story, there would be no turning back. The cabin wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a haunted location. It was a threshold point where the living and the dead, the real and the imagined, all crossed paths. And now, I was trapped here. Not in the cabin. Not in the world I had known. I was trapped in the story. In that moment, I realized something horrifying. The stories we tell, the ones we share in the dark corners of the internet, the ones we whisper in the quiet hours of the night they live, they take on a life of their own, and they don't stop until they've reached the ones they're meant for. The listeners, you, the story I started, the story that had been mine, was no longer just mine. It was yours too, and it would follow you, because once you hear it, you become part of it, and you can never escape. The darkness closed in, and I felt myself slipping, no longer sure where the story ended and I began. The whispers echoed louder, until all that was left was the sound of your name, waiting to be heard. And that, dear listeners, is the story I was never meant to tell. The story of the thing that follows, the one that waits, the one that never ends, until it finds you. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was sitting at my desk, late at night, going through emails when one caught my eye. The subject line was simple: the creepiest thing happened to me in 2024. At first, I thought it was just another one of those generic stories, something about haunted houses or creepy encounters in the woods. But then, I started reading. I need to get this off my chest. It started. I don't know how to explain what happened, but I have to tell someone. And I think you might be the right person to listen. The email went on to describe a series of events that sounded too unsettling to be just a coincidence. It began with a man, a regular guy, just like anyone else. He had a life, a job, and a family. But something dark, something far from ordinary, had begun to shadow him. It started with an eerie feeling, a sensation that something was always just behind him. He could never shake the feeling of being watched. At first, he thought it was paranoia. Everyone has those moments, right? When you're alone at night and you hear a creak in the floorboards, or you swear you saw something move in the corner of your eye. But then it got worse. It wasn't just the feeling anymore. It was the whispers, faint at first, so soft that he thought it might be the wind or a trick of the mind. But the more he tried to ignore them, the louder they became. He described the whispers as coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It wasn't like hearing a voice. It was more like hearing the air itself talk, low and guttural, as if the earth itself had something to say. "They know," the whispers would say. "They know where you are." But what really freaked him out was when the lights began to flicker. At first, it was subtle, just a few quick blinks, barely noticeable. But over the course of several nights, the flickering became more frequent. His house lights would flash on and off in a way that seemed deliberate, as though someone or something was trying to get his attention. The man couldn't sleep. The shadows in his room started moving, even when he was awake. He thought he was losing his mind, but he wasn't. The shadows weren't just playing tricks on him, they were real. Something was coming for him. One night, it got too much to bear. He left his house, hoping some fresh air would clear his head. As he stepped outside, the chill of winter biting at his skin, he felt wrong. Like the world had shifted in a way he couldn't quite explain. And then, as he turned back to his house, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing in the window, just behind the curtains, was a figure. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were hollow and black, like pits that sucked in the light around them. Its form was tall, thin, and impossibly still, as if it were waiting for him. He tried to tell himself it was just his mind playing tricks, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. That was the moment everything changed. Now, what I'm about to tell you next, I still can't believe it. I wish I could say it was all in his head, but it wasn't. It wasn't a nightmare or a figment of his imagination. It was real. The man, let's call him Jake, decided to do what any of us would do in a situation like that. He tried to find answers. He reached out to local paranormal investigators, hoping for a scientific explanation, maybe even a way to protect himself. But the investigators? They weren't much help. They didn't even make it to his house. You see, the night they were supposed to meet, Jake received a strange phone call. The voice on the other end was soft, almost like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. The voice said only one thing: "They know. They found you." The investigators never showed up, and from that moment on, things escalated quickly. Jake was in full panic mode at this point. He didn't know who or what was after him, but it was clear that whatever it was, it had made him its target. The whispers, the flickering lights, and the shadowy figure in his window in one of it felt like mere coincidence anymore. It felt like a curse, or worse, a game. And he was the prey. He thought about moving, but then a chilling thought struck him. What if, wherever he went, it would follow? Could he ever escape it? Desperate, Jake contacted a psychic. She was an older woman, known for her ability to communicate with spirits. He wasn't sure if he believed in all that, but at this point, he was willing to try anything. When the psychic arrived at his house, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She immediately walked into the living room, her eyes scanning every corner of the room as if something invisible were lurking in the shadows. She spoke without turning to him. "It's here," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's been here for a long time." Jake's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What is it? Can you stop it?" The psychic turned to him slowly. "This thing, whatever it is, it feeds off fear, and it's been feeding on yours since the day it first contacted you. It's in your house, in your mind. The more you try to fight it, the stronger it becomes." The air in the room grew thick, heavy, like the very atmosphere was closing in on them. I could almost feel it myself, like I was there, experiencing the weight of it all through Jake's eyes. I can only imagine how it must have felt for him. The psychic said she needed to perform a ritual, something that could drive the presence out of Jake's home. But as she prepared her tools, candles, incense, strange objects, I couldn't quite make out Jake. began to feel a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that his breath turned to fog. Then, the lights flickered. But this time, they didn't just flicker. They began to pulse like a heartbeat, faster and faster, until they exploded in a series of loud pops. Jake was frozen. His skin tingled, his heart racing, every nerve screaming to run. But there was no escape. Before the psychic could even react, the whispering started again. But this time, it wasn't just faint and distant. It was all around them, loud and insistent, filling every corner of the room, the floorboards, the air. And then came the voice. "You shouldn't have called for help," it rasped. "Now, you're ours." The psychic stumbled back, her face pale with terror. It's here," she gasped, barely able to speak. Her eyes darted around, but no one could see what she saw. Then, in the flickering light, Jake saw it again. The figure. This time, it wasn't just standing behind the curtains, it was right there in front of him. Its face was contorted, a grotesque mass of dark shadows that didn't resemble any human form he had ever seen. Its eyes, those black voids, locked onto him, and he felt his mind begin to unravel. Suddenly, he couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, as if an invisible force was pressing down on him. His body trembled uncontrollably, and the room seemed to close in on him. It was suffocating, like the walls themselves were alive, pushing in, crushing him from every direction. I can't take it," he cried out, his voice barely audible over the deafening whispers. The psychic tried to grab a talisman from her bag, but her hands were shaking. The figure stepped closer to Jake, and that was when he heard the laughter. It wasn't human. It wasn't even an animal. It was something ancient, something evil, as if the very essence of darkness was mocking him. Then, everything went black. Jake woke up hours later in his own bed. But the thing was, he wasn't sure if he had actually woken up. The room was the same, but everything felt off. The air was still cold, and the shadows that had once felt like a mere trick of the light now seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. He quickly realized that nothing had been solved. The figure was still there. The whispers still lingered in the corners of his mind. And most terrifying of all, he now knew something that terrified him more than anything else. Whatever was after him wasn't just trying to drive him mad. It wasn't just after his life. It was after his soul. In a final attempt to find answers, Jake researched every possible theory he could. Find everything from hauntings, demonic entities, to curses and ancient rituals. The more he looked, the more he understood that what he was dealing with was far beyond anything he could fight with conventional means. One theory caught his attention. A curse that was passed down through generations, tied to a specific location. A curse that couldn't be broken by simple rituals or by running away. No, this curse could only be stopped in one way, by confronting the entity at the very place where it had first begun. That place, according to the legend, was the old house on the outskirts of town, the one that everyone had forgotten about, the one that no one dared approach, the house that Jake had driven past every day of his life, never knowing the horror that lay hidden inside. He knew what he had to do. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. Every moment, every passing second felt like it could be his last. The air in his house was thick with the lingering presence of that thing, that dark force that had made his life a living nightmare. The whispers, the flickering lights, and the ever-present shadowy figure, they had all become so much a part of his reality that he didn't know where the terror began and his mind ended anymore. The cursed house on the outskirts of town was his only hope, and Jake knew he had to face it. No more running, no more hiding. He had to go there, confront whatever was waiting for him, and he hoped ended. Once and for all. That night, he set out, the dread building up inside him with every mile he drove. The town was eerily quiet as he made his way down the darkened road. Even the wind had gone still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. And when he reached the old house, a chill settled in the pit of his stomach. The house stood like a decaying monument to a forgotten past. Its windows were boarded up, its roof sagging under the weight of time. Vines and weeds had taken over the yard, curling around the porch like skeletal hands reaching out to drag anyone who dared approach inside. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Jake hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to get back in his car and drive away from this nightmare. But the thought of the thing following him, of it continuing to torment him for the rest of his life, pushed him forward. He had no choice. He stepped inside. The air was damp and stale, and the house smelled of rot and decay. The floorboards creaked underfoot as he moved deeper into the house, his every step echoing in the silence. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the faint remnants of old furniture were scattered around the rooms like forgotten memories. And then he heard it, the whispering. That low, guttural voice that had haunted him for weeks. It came from every direction, as if the house itself were alive and speaking to him. Jake's heart raced, his breath quickening. He wanted to turn back, but the thought of what was waiting for him in the shadows, the thing that had been stalking him, kept him moving forward. He found himself in the living room, standing in front of a large, cracked mirror that hung crookedly on the wall. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't right. His eyes were hollow, his face pale, as though the life had been drained from him. His hands shook, his mind reeling from the suffocating pressure of the place. And then, the door slammed shut behind him. Jake spun around, but there was no one there. The house felt alive with the weight of something unseen, something just out of reach. His chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, the words clearer now. "Come closer," the voice called, a chilling command that sent ice coursing through his veins. "You've come this far. Now you belong to us." Jake's blood ran cold. His thoughts scattered, and the panic set in like a vice around his chest. He turned back to the mirror, and this time, his reflection didn't just stare back at him, it moved. It grinned. The smile on his reflection twisted, stretching unnaturally wide, its eyes now fully black, voids that sucked in all the light around them. Jake stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his throat. But the reflection didn't stop. It reached out, its hand pushing through the glass, inch by inch, until its fingers brushed against the edges of the frame. And as it touched the mirror, the air around Jake grew thick, suffocating. Suddenly, he heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway behind him. He turned to face the sound, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there, except for the shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, stretching across the walls and floor like some monstrous thing that didn't belong in this world. It was moving closer to him, its form flickering in and out of existence, like it was both there and not there at the same time. The darkness seemed to bleed from it, swirling around the room like an ink spill. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't fight this. He couldn't run. The thing was everywhere, all at once. He knew deep down that he was too late. He had made a fatal mistake by coming here. The shadow's form finally solidified, and it stepped forward, revealing its grotesque, twisted face. Its mouth was too wide, its eyes too black, its presence too wrong. And as it opened its mouth, Jake heard something that made his blood freeze. A voice. The same voice that had whispered to him. The voice that had tormented him all this time. "You should never have come here," it said, the words seeping into his skin, into his very soul. "Now, you will be ours forever." Jake tried to scream, but the words were stolen from him. His body felt frozen in place, his legs unable to move, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. And then, As the shadow reached out to him, the air grew heavier, darker, suffocating. Jake could feel it. The thing was taking him, pulling him into its endless darkness, where he would be trapped forever. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the reflection of himself, smiling back at him with those hollow black eyes. Jake's world went dark, a suffocating void that consumed everything in its path. For a long moment, he felt nothing. No pain, no fear. Just an endless blackness that stretched on forever. It was as if he had slipped into another world, a place where time didn't exist, and he had no identity, just a shell, an empty vessel waiting to be filled. Then, the whispers started again. But this time, they were not in the air. They were inside his mind. He could hear them clearly, as though they were part of his very thoughts. Their words were alien, ancient, and yet they felt strangely familiar. "You are ours," the voice intoned. "You have always been ours. You just didn't know it." Jake tried to scream, but no sound came. He tried to move, to fight, but his limbs felt like they were made of lead, heavy and unresponsive. He was trapped in this place, with no escape. The shadow that had consumed him was not just a creature of darkness. It was something older, something beyond comprehension. It wasn't trying to kill him. No, it wanted something far worse. It wanted his soul, his essence, to bind him to this place, to make him one of its own. He could feel it pulling at him, siphoning his very being away, piece by piece. His memories began to fade, slipping through his fingers like sand. The faces of his loved ones, the warmth of the sun, the sound of laughter, all of it was disappearing, replaced by the cold, cruel emptiness that surrounded him. But then, something changed. A flicker of light pierced the darkness, a tiny, fragile beam that pushed through the blackness like a single star in an endless night. It was faint, distant, but it was enough. Jake clung to it, desperately. He didn't know what it was, but it was his only hope. Slowly, painfully, he began to move toward it. His limbs felt heavy, like they were moving through molasses, but he didn't care. He had to reach the light. It was the only thing that might save him. As he moved, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the shadow, the thing that had taken him, was trying to stop him from escaping. But Jake didn't listen. He pushed forward, through the darkness, through the oppressive silence, his heart beating faster with each step. Finally, the light grew stronger. It became brighter, blinding, until it surrounded him completely, engulfing him in its warmth. And then, everything stopped. For a moment, Jake thought he was dead. He couldn't feel the presence of the shadow anymore. The whispers were gone. His body, once heavy and broken, now felt light. He opened his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could see. The world around him had changed. He was no longer in the decaying house, no longer surrounded by the suffocating darkness. Instead, he found himself standing in a place that was quiet and still. It was like a dream, but it wasn't. It was real. He was outside, in the middle of a vast, empty field, with nothing but the wide open sky above him and the soft breeze brushing against his skin. It felt peaceful. But then, just as quickly as the peace had come, it shattered. Jake felt a presence again, a dark, ominous weight that pressed down on him, suffocating him with its force. He turned, and there it was. The figure, the shadow. It was standing at the edge of the field, watching him with those hollow, black eyes. And then the voice, that same voice that had tormented him, echoed in his mind once more. "You can never escape us," it whispered. "We are eternal." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He thought he had escaped. He thought he had gotten away, that the light had saved him. But now he understood the truth. This wasn't over. It would never be over. Jake tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. It was like the shadow had him trapped, even in this new, seemingly peaceful world. The figure was still there, standing motionless at the edge of the field, its black eyes fixed on him. And then, slowly, it began to move towards him. Jake could feel his heartbeat in his throat as he stumbled back, his mind racing. He had nowhere to go. There was nothing here, nothing but the endless horizon and the oppressive presence of the shadow. And it was getting closer, step by step. But then something strange happened. The ground beneath him began to crack, lines of fissures spreading out like a web, and from the cracks came more shadows. They swarmed around him, growing in number, swirling like a storm, engulfing him. And then, the worst part of it all, the whispers returned. But now they weren't just whispers. They were voices, thousands of them, all speaking at once, all telling him the same thing. "You belong to us now, forever," Jake screamed. But no sound escaped his lips. He could feel his body being pulled, drawn into the shadows. He fought, struggling to break free, but it was hopeless. The darkness consumed him completely, swallowing him whole. And just like that, he was gone. The story ended there, but I can't help but wonder, was it all a nightmare? Was it the result of too many sleepless nights, too much fear? Or was there something real behind it all? Jake's disappearance was never explained. The house was abandoned again, the field left undisturbed. And yet, I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, something waiting, watching, just beyond the edge of the light. I remember the first time I read it. The sender's name was Sarah, and she described something she'd been dealing with in her family's home out in the middle of nowhere. As she put it, "We've always had strange things happen here, but it's getting worse. I need to know if anyone else has experienced this kind of thing, and if there's any way to stop it." That alone should have been enough to make me hesitate, but my curiosity got the better of me. As I scrolled down, Sarah detailed events that had been unfolding at her house for months. What started as the occasional creak in the floorboards or strange shadows in the corner of her eyes had turned into something far more sinister. The house, built over a century ago, had always felt off to her. The lights flickered, doors would swing open on their own, and at night, the walls would hum with a noise that sounded almost like whispers. But then, the real horror began. It was the third paragraph that really caught my attention. Sarah described how, one evening, she had been in the kitchen cooking dinner. The house was quiet, too quiet, but that was nothing new. She'd grown used to the silence. But that night, she noticed something strange. The shadows in the hallway weren't like the usual darkness, no. These were moving. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light. But as she glanced closer, she saw them shapes, figures, standing in the hall where there should have been nothing but empty space. It wasn't until she stepped into the hallway that the real terror began. She said, "The shadows followed me, moving like they were alive, shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. I ran to my bedroom and locked the door, but they were there. They were always there, watching, waiting." That was just the beginning. Sarah claimed that whatever was in her house had grown more aggressive over time. Items were moved around. Family members started seeing things that weren't supposed to exist. And the worst part? It didn't seem to care who saw it or when. It would wait, bide its time, until, eventually, it made its move. What Sarah wrote next, I didn't know if I should believe it, but at the same time, something about her story felt real. Too real. Sarah mentioned that she'd been hearing something at night. It started out faint, just a scratching, like nails on wood, but the sounds grew louder, more frantic. She described waking up in the middle of the night to hear someone or something breathing heavily at the foot of her bed. But when she turned on the light, nothing was there. One night, she wrote, the sound didn't stop. It got closer and closer. She couldn't see anything in the dark, but she knew it was there. And then the worst thing happened. She saw a face, twisted, pale, and contorted with what could only be described as a grotesque grin. Sarah's words were simple but chilling. It was smiling at me. And that's when things went from eerie to downright horrifying. She told me about a night when she had come home late from a visit to her mother's. Her father had been waiting up for her, but when she walked into the living room, there was a look on his face that stopped her dead in her tracks. He was staring at the wall, his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes wide and glassy, as though something had stripped him of his will to move, to speak, to even blink. The house was silent again, but there was an overwhelming sense of dread hanging in the air. Sarah ran to her father, shaking him, but there was no response. And then, just as she was about to call for help, the light above them flickered and buzzed. It didn't stop. And when it finally did, the darkness that followed was suffocating. That was the last time Sarah saw her father the same way. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maybe this is all just a bad dream, or a series of coincidences strung together. Maybe Sarah was exaggerating, or just trying to get attention. But the thing is, she wasn't. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it all as a bunch of wild, unfounded rumors, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with her story. I had to know more. But before I reached out to her for any details, something happened that changed everything. Something that would make me realize this wasn't just a story, it was a warning. The day after I received Sarah's email, I couldn't get the images from her story out of my head. I tried to distract myself, thinking that I'd maybe just misunderstood her words, that it was all in her head, some collective anxiety or grief manifesting in strange ways. But when I closed my eyes, I still saw the shadows, shifting and flickering across the walls, like something that belonged to another world. Something that shouldn't exist. I was pacing back and forth in my office when my phone rang. It was Sarah. My heart skipped a beat. I had expected her to reply by email, but this? A phone call was something entirely different. "Hello?" I answered, trying to sound calm, though my voice betrayed me. "Mr. Lights, it's Sarah." Her voice was shaking, quiet almost as if she was afraid of being overheard. I need to tell you something else. Something you need to know." "Sarah, take your time. I'm here for you," I said, trying to reassure her. "I don't know how to explain this, but after I wrote to you, things started getting worse. I thought I could fight it. I thought if I just ignored it, it would stop. But last night, it followed me." I swallowed hard. I could feel my pulse racing in my neck, the blood rushing to my head as her words echoed through the phone. "Followed you? What do you mean? What happened?" "I was at the store with my brother. It was just a quick trip, nothing strange. We got home around 11:30, and the house felt cold, too cold. I thought maybe the heater had gone out, but when I stepped inside, I heard it. The sound I told you about, the scratching. It was loud, like nails on a chalkboard. It was coming from upstairs. My brother, he didn't hear it, but I could. I went up to check on my father, but his door was closed. I knocked, but there was no answer, so I pushed it open. I felt a chill run through me as Sarah's voice dropped to a near whisper. My father wasn't there, but there was something else. I held my breath, waiting. What was it? A face. A twisted, pale face, grinning at me from the corner of his room. But it wasn't my father's face. It was wrong. It was like it had been stitched together, the skin pulled too tight, the eyes too wide, and the smile, I can't explain it. It was like it was waiting for me to come in, like it was expecting me. I felt my own chest tighten. "Did you see the face move? Did it do anything?" She paused for a long time before answering. It didn't have to move. It was already there, watching me, almost like it was tethered to the room. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, while the face just stared. There was a crackling silence on the line as I tried to process what she was telling me. My mind was racing. What happened next? Sarah, are you okay? I ran. I ran as fast as I could, downstairs, out of the house. But I swear, when I looked back, I saw the shadows moving in the windows. They weren't just shadows anymore, they were things. Things with arms, legs, and faces like that thing in my father's room. And the worst part? I braced myself for what was coming next. They were following me. The line went silent, the air around us thick, with the terror I could almost hear seeping through the phone. I had to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. What did you do? I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go back inside, but I couldn't leave either. My brother, he was still in the house. I didn't know where he was, and I didn't want to find out. You have to leave, Sarah. You need to get out of there, get help, I urged, panic rising in my throat. I tried, she said, her voice barely audible. But when I went back to the front door, it was locked. The lights flickered, and I saw those things outside. They weren't human. They were wrong. I don't know what they were, but they were waiting. My mind was racing, unable to grasp the magnitude of what she was describing. The terror in her voice was real, and every instinct told me that something far darker than we both could understand was at work. That's when I saw it, right behind me, standing at the window. It wasn't just a face anymore. It was like the whole room was alive, its walls breathing, pulsing with something that wasn't human, and it spoke. I gasped. It spoke? What did it say? Sarah's voice cracked, and I could hear her struggling to steady her breath. It said, "You can't run from us." The call cut out before she could finish. I stared at the phone, heart hammering in my chest. I immediately tried calling her back, but there was no answer. I left a message, then another, but still nothing. I sat there for what felt like hours, feeling the weight of what I had just heard sinking in. But then, something strange happened. As I sat there, a message appeared on my screen. It wasn't from Sarah, but from an unknown number. It was short, just one line, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. "They're coming for you next." The message lingered on my screen, glowing in the darkness of my room. "They're coming for you next." The words burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. But what? Who was it that had sent that message? And why was I, of all people, involved? I shook off the thought, trying to focus. Sarah's situation was still the priority. But when I tried calling her again, the phone went straight to voicemail. That eerie sense of dread started creeping over me. The feeling that I wasn't just hearing a tale from a faraway place, I was connected to it somehow, like I was a part of the nightmare. I couldn't just sit here. I needed to find out what had happened to Sarah. I grabbed my coat and headed to the car, my mind whirling with fear and confusion. The road to her house wasn't too far away, but I had no idea what I was walking into. Could I really believe her story? Had I already let my imagination run wild, or was something truly terrible unfolding right now? The drive was long and quiet, the only sounds being the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind rattling the trees. The sky was an ominous shade of gray, and I felt a strange tension hanging in the air, like a storm was just on the horizon. As I approached Sarah's house, I noticed something strange. The lights, they were on, all of them, but something was off. The lights were flickering, not like a typical electrical issue, but in a way that made the whole house feel alive. The windows seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing, like they were watching me approach. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled up to the driveway. I stepped out of the car and felt an unsettling chill, even though the air was still. The house loomed before me, dark and silent, despite the lights. The front door was ajar, a thin sliver of darkness beckoning me inside. I hesitated, but I couldn't leave, not when Sarah needed help. I pushed the door open, and as soon as I did, the temperature inside the house seemed to drop. My breath came out in a mist, and the air tasted like it had been left to stagnate for too long. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty hallway. No answer. I moved deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking under my feet. Every step seemed to amplify the silence around me. The place felt wrong. It wasn't just the odd way the lights flickered or the strange coldness in the air, it was something in the walls. Something watching. I made my way up the stairs, slowly, each creak of the steps sending a shiver up my spine. As I reached the top, the door to Sarah's father's room caught my eye. It was wide open. I could see nothing but darkness beyond it. I pushed the door open further, holding my breath. The room was empty, except for the same feeling of suffocating dread that hung in the air. But then, I saw it. On the floor, what looked like a dark stain, but it wasn't just dirt or dust. It was something wet, glistening in the dim light from the hallway. I knelt down, my stomach turning. It was a smear of something thick and black, almost like oil. But there was something more to it. As I ran my fingers over the stain, I realized it wasn't just dirt. It felt like skin cold and unnatural. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. I jumped to my feet, heart racing. "Sarah?" I yelled, my voice cracking. My eyes darted back to the hallway, but there was no sign of her. I quickly moved downstairs, following the sound. My head was spinning. Was it her? Was it them? The shadows? The things she'd warned me about? When I reached the living room, the sight that greeted me nearly stopped my heart. There, standing by the window, was Sarah, but she wasn't herself. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unfocused, staring blankly ahead. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but no sound came out. The air felt thick, like it was suffocating me as I watched her standing perfectly still, as though frozen in time. "Sarah!" I shouted, rushing toward her. But just as I was about to reach her, the room went cold. The walls began to hum again, that same low vibration that she had described to me. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I spun around, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The shadows, they were moving. They weren't just in the corners anymore. They were crawling up the walls, bending in ways that no normal shadow should be able to. And then, just as quickly as the shadows had come to life, they all stopped. The silence was deafening. The coldness lingered in the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something that had been waiting for me, for Sarah, for anyone foolish enough to walk into this house. "Sarah, we need to leave," I said, grabbing her arm, but she didn't move. She was like a puppet, lifeless and unresponsive, her body rigid. And then I heard it. The whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder closer. A voice, not from Sarah, but from the walls themselves. "You're too late." I felt the ground beneath me tremble, and before I could react, the entire room plunged into darkness. The darkness was absolute. It wasn't just the kind of blackness that filled a room when the lights went out. This was something different. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I reached out, but I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Panic crept up my spine, my heart pounding harder with every passing second. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice trembling in the oppressive silence. I didn't know what else to say, what else to do. I had to get out of here, but I couldn't leave her like this. There was no answer, only the silence. And then that whisper again. It wasn't Sarah, it was something else. "You cannot escape." The voice sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't human, it was distorted, as if it was being spoken through layers of darkness itself. I stumbled back, trying to find my bearings, but the weight of the darkness made it feel like I was moving through water, slow and heavy. I felt around for anything that might give me a clue about what was happening. My fingers brushed against something cold, something that felt like stone. I grabbed it instinctively, and then there was a flash of light. For a split second, the room came into view, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The shadows on the walls were alive. Not just shadows, but things. Dark, twisted figures that crawled and writhed like serpents, their bodies stretching and contorting in impossible shapes. They were alive in a way that shouldn't have been possible. They were moving closer, inch by inch, as if they were drawn to my every breath, every heartbeat. And then I saw Sarah again. She was standing there, unmoving, her eyes blank, staring at nothing. Her body wasn't her own anymore. It was like the darkness had taken her, twisted her into something unrecognizable. But it wasn't just her appearance that had changed. There was something inside her, a presence of something that wasn't human. It wasn't just possessing her, it was controlling her, bending her will like a puppet on strings. "Sarah!" I cried, but she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. The shadows were getting closer, surrounding us. I could feel the cold, that suffocating chill, pressing against my skin, crawling into my bones. My breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with something foul. My heart raced as I backed away, my hands trembling, looking for an escape. But then something worse happened. From the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a face. It wasn't just another shadow. This was something else, something towering, something that shouldn't have been. It was humanoid in shape, but wrong. Its body was made of shifting darkness, limbs that twisted and stretched in unnatural angles. Its eyes were pits of endless black, like bottomless wells, and its mouth was open, a gaping maw filled with rows of jagged, broken teeth. It was standing at the far end of the room, just behind Sarah. And then, in a voice that was more of a growl than words, it spoke again. "She's ours now." I froze, my body locked in place, unable to move. The terror in my chest threatened to crush me as I watched the creature step forward. Each movement was deliberate, as though it were savoring the fear in the air. It didn't need to move fast. It didn't need to chase me. The very presence of it was the chase. Without thinking, I bolted for the door. My feet were slipping beneath me as I ran, the darkness threatening to pull me back with every step. The shadows were all around me now, clawing at my skin, trying to drag me back into the suffocating blackness. The walls seemed to stretch and bend, warping the space around me. I could feel them, could feel the things in the walls, scraping and whispering, always just a few inches from my ear. And then I heard Sarah's voice, but it wasn't her, not anymore. "You cannot leave." I whipped around, panic rising in my chest, and saw her again. Her body was moving now, jerky and unnatural, her limbs twitching in a way that made my stomach churn. She wasn't the person I had known. She was them now, the thing that had taken over her, the thing that had claimed her. I turned back to the door, only to find it blocked. The shadows had closed in. The walls seemed to have swallowed it whole. I was trapped. The figure in the corner stepped forward again, its form rippling like ink in water, as though it was becoming part of the shadows themselves. It was too close now, and I could hear its breath, a rasping, gurgling sound that made my skin crawl. It was speaking again, but this time, its words were not a whisper. It was speaking directly to me. "This is where you die." I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind screaming for me to do something, anything. But my legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. The air was thick with something so vile that it made me want to gag. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even scream. The last thing I saw was Sarah's empty eyes, her lifeless expression as the shadows reached out and enveloped her, and then I was consumed by darkness. I don't know how much time passed after that. I'm not even sure what happened next. Everything went black, and I was swallowed whole by the void that seemed to stretch on forever. But when I woke up, I wasn't in the house anymore. I was in a place that didn't belong to this world. The walls were shifting, alive with a dark, pulsating energy. The air was thick with dread, but it wasn't the same kind of fear I had felt before. It was colder, more suffocating. It felt like I was deep underwater, cut off from everything I knew. I looked around, trying to orient myself, but the place felt wrong in a way that defied all logic. And then I saw them, figures, standing in the shadows, waiting, watching. They weren't human. Not anymore. One of them stepped forward. It was the thing from Sarah's house, the figure that had haunted her, that had controlled her. It looked at me with those black, hollow eyes, and I could feel it. It was in my mind, crawling inside me, claiming me. It leaned down close, and in a voice that was both inside my head and in the air around me, it whispered, "You were never meant to escape." And then everything went dark again. And I knew, deep down, that the real horror had only just begun. I've never been the superstitious type. Sure, I've heard the tales, seen the documentaries on haunted houses, and laughed off the warnings about old furniture being cursed or objects carrying evil energy. But that was all at Wasteries. That was before my story began. And believe me, it started with something as simple as a floorboard. I moved into the house back in early spring. It was an old place, maybe over 100 years old, tucked away at the end of a winding road. The kind of place you find at the edge of small towns, where no one bothers you and everyone keeps to themselves. The house had its charm, or at least it seemed that way at first. The old wooden beams, the creaky stairs, the massive fireplace, perfect for someone who'd been living in the city too long and craved solitude. But it didn't take long before I noticed something was off. It was subtle at first, almost like a draft that you can't pinpoint. Late at night, I'd hear faint sounds coming from beneath the floorboards. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses do that, right? But after a few weeks, it became more than just the creak of wood. It started with whispers, quiet at first, so soft that I questioned whether I had imagined it. It wasn't in any particular language, just fragmented, unintelligible sounds. But they came from beneath my feet, from deep within the floorboards of the living room. I'd sit in my armchair, reading a book, and they would start like a faint murmur rising through the wood. I tried to ignore it. I even told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal trapped in the crawl space. But one night, it happened when I was alone. I had just returned from work, tired and wanting nothing more than to rest. I sank into the chair, my eyes half closed, and that's when I heard it again. The whispering, it was louder this time, clearer. "Help us," it said. A voice, raspy, cracked like it had been buried for years. I shot up from the chair, heart racing. I looked around the room, my eyes darting to every corner, expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the silence of the empty house. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the kind of thing you hear when you're sleep-deprived or anxious. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more the whispers grew. They didn't come just at night anymore. They were there during the day, too. Sometimes they sounded like multiple voices, sometimes just one, but they always seemed to come from beneath the floor. I did what any rational person would do. I called in a handyman. He came over, crawled under the house to check the foundation, looked around for any signs of rodents or structural issues. He didn't find anything. He even joked about the place being haunted, but I wasn't laughing. The whispers had started to grow more distinct. "Help us, please. She's coming." That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder than ever, as if they were trying to break through the floor. I walked into the living room, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The house felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few minutes. I knelt down, placing my ear against the floor. The whispers were deafening now, like they were right there with me, inside my head. Please. The floor beneath me suddenly creaked, a heavy, sickening sound, like something shifting underneath. My breath caught in my throat. Without thinking, I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and began prying up the floorboards. The nails came loose with a screech, and I peeled back the old wood, exposing the dark space below. But there was nothing there, just dust, dirt, and the faint smell of mildew. I couldn't explain it. The whispers had stopped the moment I lifted the boards, but the air felt thick now, suffocating. As I stood there, staring at the open floor, I noticed something I hadn't before, a small, weathered object half buried in the dirt. It was a ring, a simple silver band, tarnished with age. I picked it up, feeling a chill run through me as soon as my fingers touched it. It wasn't just a ring, it was something much older, and as soon as I held it, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. She's here. I dropped the ring as though it had burned me, and it fell back into the dirt. The whispers stopped immediately. But that night, I didn't sleep, not a single second. The mirror had always been a centerpiece in the old house. It stood in the hallway, tall and grand, with a dark, ornate frame that seemed out of place in such an ordinary home. It was the first thing I noticed when I moved in, its reflective surface seeming to gleam under the dim light of the hallway. I'd often find myself staring into it, watching the reflection of the room around me, almost as if I were expecting something to appear behind me. I tried to ignore it, but over time, I started to notice things. At first, it was just odd, like how the reflections sometimes seemed to lag a fraction of a second behind my movements. I chalked it up to the aging glass, maybe some minor distortion over the years. But soon, things started to get stranger. One evening, after a long day, I was walking past the mirror when I froze. I had been so tired that I hadn't even paid attention to my reflection. But then, I saw her. A woman. She was standing in the hallway, just behind me, her face pale and distorted. Her eyes, I don't think I can describe them without feeling the same terror I felt in that moment. They were wide open, unblinking and hollow, like two black pits staring into my soul. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. My pulse raced, and my breath came out in sharp gasps. I turned back to the mirror, and she was still there, standing in the reflection, staring right at me. I backed away from the mirror, but her eyes never left mine. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, but eventually, I ran to the safety of my bedroom and locked the door behind me. That night, I couldn't shake the image of her from my mind. The thought of her cold, empty eyes haunted me. I didn't dare go near the mirror again. But the next day, I found myself walking past it, as though it had some sort of pull over me. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a hallucination, something my mind had conjured from stress and exhaustion. But as I glanced at my reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was something wrong. The hallway behind me looked different, the colors of the room distorted. And there, standing at the edge of the reflection, was the woman again. She wasn't just in the mirror anymore. She was in the hallway. I stared at the reflection, heart hammering in my chest, trying to process what I was seeing. The woman was no longer just a distorted image in the mirror. She stood there in the hallway, just beyond the edge of the frame, her black eyes locked on me. I could feel her presence like an icy breath against my skin, but when I spun around, there was nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it should have been. My hands trembled as I reached out for the mirror, almost as if something compelled me to do so. My fingers brushed against the cold glass, and that's when I noticed that the reflection was no longer lagging. The woman's movements were synchronized with mine. She followed me, her head tilting ever so slightly as I stepped back, her hollow eyes never leaving mine. I jerked my hand away and backed into the wall. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I struggled to think clearly. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? The whispers from beneath the floorboards came rushing back to me, louder now, swirling through my thoughts. The woman in the mirror? The whispers? The cold that had settled into my bones ever since I'd found that cursed ring? Could they all be connected? I had to get out of the house. I had to leave before whatever this thing was this presence got any stronger. But every time I tried to make my way to the door, something would stop me. A pull from behind, an urge to turn around and look into the mirror. I couldn't resist. It was like I was under some kind of spell. I grabbed my jacket and hurried out of the house, desperate for air, desperate to escape the suffocating presence that seemed to cling to every corner of that place. I walked aimlessly through the streets, barely noticing the darkening sky above. The streets were quiet, the world outside the house unchanged, but my mind was spinning. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The image of the woman in the hallway, her blank eyes, her presence so real too real haunted me. I didn't know what to do. The house had become a prison, a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare seemed to blur. The next day, I couldn't stay away. Something drew me back, some insidious force I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just fear, or perhaps a need for answers. I didn't know. But I walked back through the door of the house, the silence greeting me like an old friend. I went straight for the living room. The floorboards were still pulled up where I had left them, the dirt and dust exposed beneath. The ring, the cursed ring, was still there. As I knelt to pick it up, I felt a coldness creep up my spine. The whispering hadn't returned, not yet anyway. But as I held the ring in my hand, I saw something I hadn't before. Etched into the silver band, almost imperceptible to the eye, was an inscription. "Help me." My pulse quickened. It was the same phrase I had heard in the whispers, the same desperate plea that had haunted me for weeks. Without thinking, I shoved the ring into my pocket, wanting to rid myself of its presence. But as I stood up, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped drastically. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the woman from the mirror. Her skin was a pale, waxy gray, her eyes wide open but empty, as though they had been carved out by some unseen hand. I froze, too terrified to scream, too terrified to move. She stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, her feet barely making a sound against the wooden floor. She reached out a hand toward me, her fingers elongating as if they were reaching for something far beyond the space we occupied. "Help me," she whispered. The same words I had heard before, but now they were coming from her mouth, from the very air around me. "Please, help me." The room seemed to grow darker. The walls closed in, the space tightening around me like a vice. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what was happening. Was this a ghost? A spirit trapped between worlds? I felt a sudden, inexplicable compulsion to run. I bolted for the front door, heart racing, but as my hand touched the doorknob, a sharp pain shot through my chest. I gasped, stumbling back. I looked down, and there it was blood. Dark, thick blood trickling down from beneath my shirt. I didn't feel any pain, but the blood kept coming, pooling at my feet like a dark puddle. I looked up, but the woman was gone. Just gone. I stumbled to the bathroom, clutching my side, my legs shaking beneath me. But when I reached the mirror, I saw her again. She was standing behind me. Her reflection wasn't just in the mirror, she was inside it, her hands pressed against the glass as though trying to break free. I backed away from the mirror, but the woman's reflection followed. reaching through the glass, her fingers stretching toward me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned and ran faster than I had ever run before. I never went back to the house after that night. I couldn't. The thought of Etov, her, haunted me. I moved in with a friend and tried to put the whole thing behind me, but I knew better. The whispers, the mirror, the blood. It had all been too real. But that's when I began to notice something strange. Over the next few weeks, I would hear the whispers, the faint murmurs, even though I was nowhere near the house. It was like they were following me. Sometimes, it sounded like they were coming from my own reflection. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I walked past a mirror at a friend's place. And there, standing behind me, was the woman. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I knew it was never over. I ran out of the house, back to the only place I could think of the house. When I arrived, the doors were wide open, inviting me in, but as soon as I crossed the threshold, everything changed. The air grew cold, thick with the same oppressive energy that had once filled that house. I walked up the stairs, the wooden boards creaking beneath my feet. I stepped into the living room, and there it was, the mirror. The reflection was different this time. The woman wasn't just behind me. She was in the room, her face twisted in rage, her mouth stretched into a grin that was anything but human. And then I understood. The whispers, the reflection, the ring, they were all connected. The curse wasn't just on the house, it was on me. The last weeks of 2024 were a blur of exhaustion and desperation. I had just moved into a tiny, run-down apartment on the outskirts of town, a hasty decision made after a string of personal losses. The rent was cheap, the neighbors kept to themselves, and most importantly, it was far away from the suffocating reminders of my old life. The building itself had a strange aura. It was a decrepit 5-story structure, its beige paint faded and flaking. The lights in the hallway flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to stretch and warp with every flash. On my first night there, I noticed that several apartments appeared to be unoccupied, their windows dark and curtains drawn tight. I was unpacking boxes when the power cut out. A heavy silence settled over the apartment, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight, and made my way to the breaker box. It was in the hallway, past the communal laundry room, where the air felt colder and the shadows deeper. As I reset the breaker, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. They were faint, but deliberate, echoing softly against the cracked linoleum floor. I spun around, my light sweeping the empty hallway. Nothing, just the dull hum of the fluorescent lights coming back to life. That night, I dreamed of the hallway, only it wasn't empty. Shadows flitted at the edges of my vision, and I could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, calling my name. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sensation of being watched lingering long after I opened my eyes. It was a few days later when I met Mrs. Ellison. She was my neighbor across the hall, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a nervous demeanor. She knocked on my door one evening, holding a plate of cookies that smelled faintly of cinnamon. "Welcome to the building," she said, her voice thin but kind. "Thought you might like a treat." I thanked her, and we chatted briefly. When I mentioned the power outage, her expression darkened. "You'll get used to it," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "This place has its quirks." Before I could ask what she meant, she excused herself and hurried back to her apartment. As she closed the door, I noticed she had 3 heavy locks installed. I'd later learned that many of the other tenants did the same. That night, the lights in the hallway went out again. I hesitated, reluctant to step into the dark, but the faint sound of shuffling feet drew me out. As I peeked into the hallway, I saw a dim glow coming from the end near the stairwell. It was faint and irregular, like someone holding a flickering candle. I called out, asking if someone needed help. The glow vanished instantly, plunging the hallway into darkness. My heart raced as I backed into my apartment and locked the door. I sat up for hours, the plate of untouched cookies on the counter, listening for any sound from the hallway. A week later, I learned about the tenant who used to live in my apartment. Mrs. Ellison mentioned it casually when I ran into her at the mailboxes. "Young man like you," she said, fidgeting with her keys, "came and went at odd hours. Then one day, he just stopped, disappeared, left everything behind, even his toothbrush." I pressed her for more details, but she clammed up, muttering something about how some places aren't meant to be lived in. The comment gnawed at me as I returned to my apartment. I started noticing little things, scratches on the doorframe that looked like they were made by fingernails, a faint damp smell that no amount of cleaning could remove, and the way my phone's signal seemed to drop whenever I was inside. Then there were the lights. They began flickering more frequently, not just in the hallway but in my apartment too. Sometimes they would dim until the room was bathed in an eerie twilight, shadows pooling in the corners and stretching unnaturally across the walls. One evening, as I sat on the couch, the lights went out entirely. I lit a candle and tried to calm myself, but the flickering flame only made the shadows dance more wildly. That's when I noticed something in the reflection of the TV screen, a figure standing just behind me. I turned, the candle nearly slipping from my hand. The room was empty. Desperate for answers, I started digging into the building's history. The landlord was evasive, brushing off my questions with vague assurances that old buildings have their issues. But Mrs. Ellison slipped me a key to the storage room in the basement. "If you really want to know," she said, "start there, but be careful." The storage room was a claustrophobic space filled with forgotten belongings, boxes of faded photos, broken furniture, and dusty stacks of VHS tapes. One box, labeled simply with my apartment number, caught my attention. Inside were several tapes, each marked with a date. The most recent one was from just a few months ago. I borrowed an old VCR from a thrift store and watched the tapes late into the night. They were grainy and silent, showing static angles of my apartment. At first, they seemed normal, just hours of uneventful footage. But then I noticed the shadows. They moved independently, writhing and shifting, even when nothing else in the frame moved. In one tape, the camera caught the previous tenant, standing in the hallway, staring at something just out of frame. His posture was rigid, his head tilted unnaturally to the side. Then he stepped forward and vanished, as though swallowed by the darkness. I decided to confront the landlord. I demanded to know what was happening in the building, who the previous tenant was, and why no one seemed to talk about the disappearances. He stared at me for a long moment before sighing heavily. "This building, it's old," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Older than it looks. Things linger here. People leave or they don't. That's all there is to it." Unsatisfied, I returned to my apartment, determined to leave the next morning. As I packed, the lights began to flicker again. The air grew heavy, and the familiar whispers filled the room, louder than ever. They were clearer now, a chorus of voices overlapping, all saying the same thing. "Stay." I grabbed my suitcase and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows on the walls twisted and converged, forming a shape that loomed impossibly large. The whispers turned to screams as the lights went out completely. I woke up on the floor, the room bathed in daylight. My suitcase was unpacked, my clothes neatly folded back into the drawers. On the coffee table sat a single VHS tape, unmarked. I haven't watched it yet. I'm too afraid of what I might see. But the whispers haven't stopped, and the shadows still move when they shouldn't. I don't know if I'll ever leave this place, or if it will let me.